Have you ever wondered why a certain type of public figure, be they a politician or a media personality, converts to Catholicism without actually seeming to uphold Catholic values? Have you wondered what Catholics think of the Trad Cath movement, especially the online version of it? More importantly, are you aware of the very serious implications of this movement and the role it's playing in far-right politics? A growing number of public figures in America are either converting to Catholicism or aligning themselves with a very specific brand of it. Not the Catholicism of working class Irish and Italian neighborhoods, not the Catholicism that drew animosity from the KKK, but a different Catholicism. One that is, dare I say, less authentic and more theatrical. I'm a cradle Catholic, so born and raised, I went to Catholic school, as did my 4 siblings. Everyone I knew growing up was Catholic. I have an uncle who is a clergy member. My upbringing was about as Catholic as could be, and I remain a Catholic to this day. And these people, these politicians, these influencers, these grifters, they kind of give me culture shock. There is an idea of Catholicism that exists on social media, and this idea is drawn both from extremist sects that predate the internet and online trends that flatten the religion into an aesthetic to create something that is, I won't say it's unrecognizable, but I will say it's kind of surreal for me, almost like the uncanny valley. So I wanted to take some time to talk about American political figures converting to Catholicism, as well as some cradle Catholics who have become more extreme with their Catholicism in the public eye. And then I want to talk about Trad Caths and why I think that whole thing has become so popular online, as well as some recent headlines regarding the Pentagon and the Vatican. But first, I want to just start with some of the general history of Catholicism in America for anyone who doesn't know, because the historical attitude towards Catholics is going to be relevant as I discuss American politicians, and it's going to be especially relevant to what I say towards the end about Trad Caths, internet culture, and politics. So, Catholicism in the United States has been here since the beginning. Not since the indigenous beginning, but since the colonial beginning, and not just with the Spanish and the French. Catholics immigrated to the colonies very early on from England, Ireland, and Scotland. While they were a minority in the first British colonies, the province of Maryland originally had a sizable Catholic population, though the province later experienced large waves of Puritan immigration that diluted the Catholic population. Some religious conflict ensued, but I won't get into all of the details of this. I'm just mentioning it to establish 2 things. First, Catholics have been here as long as Protestants, as a minority, but still here. And 2, despite conflict between different Christian denominations, America did settle into a relatively tolerant climate, at least towards other Christians. None of this conflict erupted into a large-scale religious war, which is actually pretty impressive when you look back on it, just because large-scale religious war is how these things tend to go. Now, Catholic immigration to the United States increased throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. It was primarily Irish and German, and this led to a nativist bias against Catholics, and nativism has come back with a vengeance. Nativism simply refers to anti-immigrant bias, and in the United States, it primarily originated in bias against German and Irish Catholic immigrants, and its application has been expanded as the United States has become more diverse. Modern nativists often use the term heritage American to denote so-called founding stock Americans. And as we'll see later on in the video, nativists are prone to purity spiraling, and a lot of this has to do with the murky ethno-religious history of the nation. Just anecdotally, my Scottish Catholic ancestors fought in the Revolutionary War and rode alongside Paul Revere, so I technically qualify as a heritage American, but since I'm not a WASP, I wouldn't pass their purity test. Evangelical and fundamentalist nativists view Christianity as a requirement for an American identity, but do not consider Catholics to be Christian. So founding stock Catholics don't actually meet the founding stock standard these people are attempting to uphold to justify their views on immigration. Again, prone to purity spiraling. Now, Catholic immigration to the United States accelerated towards the end of the 19th century, when we experienced a lot of Italian and Polish immigration, which occurred alongside a large wave of Eastern European Jewish immigration. and a political divide quickly grew, with, generally speaking, Catholics and Jews on one side and Protestants on the other. Catholics and Jews, as recent immigrants, were more likely to be impoverished, and thus formed a working class identity, playing a key role in labor unions. As blue-collar Catholics formed a middle-class identity, though, some of them migrated away from the Democratic Party towards the end of the 20th century. Nixon and Reagan courted a lot of the Catholics, the so-called white ethnics, and they shifted right. The left-wing Catholics still remain to this day. A lot of the most prominent Democrats in the United States, from Nancy Pelosi to Joe Biden, are Catholic. Hispanic Catholics continue to lean left, despite attempts by the right to court them. The only exception really is in Florida, where Italian Catholic Governor Ron DeSantis has made some inroads with Hispanic Catholic voters. It's also worth mentioning that the pro-life movement drove a lot of white Catholics towards the Republican Party. The start of the culture war with Roe v. Wade allowed the Republicans to use family values to create an interdenominational Christian coalition we know as the modern religious right. And the coalition remains today, though you can see that if you look at the data, while white Catholics are largely Republican, a Catholic Democrat like Joe Biden can draw some of them in. Additionally, they are not as Republican as, say, white evangelicals, though not as Democratic as Jews or Hispanic Catholics. Now, one more thing here, historically, there was a lot of suspicion towards Catholics stirred up by nativists due to their loyalty to the Pope. There was a belief that Catholics would choose Rome over Washington. This is something that came up consistently throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, and in the 20th century, this came up quite a bit during JFK's presidential campaign, although the sentiment wasn't so strong that it kept him from winning his election. And this was a concern decades ago, but Catholics proved their willingness to bleed for the nation in 2 world wars, with many German and Italian Catholics going to war against the countries of their ancestors, and we've moved on to other things, right? Unfortunately, the internet is opening old wounds, because doing so makes for really good content, and in making this content, they can meme conflict into reality. And so this suspicion of foreign allegiance is something that I'm going to bring up later on when I discuss the Trad Cath movement, but just put a pin in it for now. Throughout the 20th century, Catholics grew in prominence in pop culture and also gained more representation in politics. I already mentioned Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden, who are 2 of the most well-known Catholics in America, and 2 of the most well-known politicians of the 21st century. There is also, of course, the Kennedy dynasty. Other very prominent Catholic political figures include Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Vice President J.D. Vance, and as of 2026, 6 of the 9 Supreme Court justices. And on the topic of Supreme Court justices, for those who don't know, Justice Barrett is a lifelong member of People of Praise, which is a parachurch community with Catholic and Pentecostal members that has been described as cult-like by former members. There are also accusations of SA and alleged subsequent cover-ups. I'll link an article from The Guardian down below if anyone would like to read more about this. Justice Sotomayor, to contrast, is also Catholic, but her roots are Puerto Rican and liberal, and she's always been a proponent of reproductive rights. So looking at these 2, you can see the diversity in Catholic approaches to politics. It is a very large umbrella. But I really want to talk about prominent American converts because I intended that as the main topic of this video. There's a certain type of person whose conversion to Catholicism appears to lend them a certain weight, a certain moral and intellectual legitimacy and authority in certain spaces, and that leads me to J.D. Vance. Vance converted to Catholicism in 2019, and it wasn't long after that he transitioned from a never-Trumper to a Republican congressman, and then, of course, Trump's vice president. And when asked about his conversion to Catholicism, he said once, quote, "I really liked that the Catholic Church was just really old." In discussing his lower-class upbringing, he also wrote for The Lamp in 2020 something that can give us a lot of insight into his view on Catholicism. Quote, "The Catholic Jesus was a majestic deity, and we had little interest in majestic deities because we weren't a majestic people." While I obviously cannot speak to Vance's actual faith, I do have to point out Catholicism can help a certain type of person to craft an elite identity. They are drawn in by the rich intellectual tradition and by the age of it, and by the incredible artistic and cultural achievements. And for some people, joining this tradition allows them to glean a sense of not just belonging, but intellectual and moral legitimacy, and even, dare I say, authority. Now, there's nothing wrong with being drawn in by Catholic intellectuals and artists. Of course, there isn't. And I'm not surprised people are attracted to this tradition in an anti intellectual culture. And I hope this is obvious, but I have absolutely no issue with converts. Many of them are lovely, kind souls. I also can't speak entirely to anyone's motives or their faith. Again, that's between them and God. However, when you're a public figure, especially a political one, personally, I'm going to scrutinize your reasoning a lot more than I would a normal person. I think for obvious reasons. Vance writes specifically about embracing atheism in college to fit in with his new elite crowd, and embracing Catholicism later helped him reconcile his elite identity with his religious identity. It seems to have helped him find a sense of belonging, which I think is something that draws a lot of people into Catholicism. Especially in today's day and age, I think people are really desperate for a sense of community and belonging and shared history and tradition, and the church can provide them with it. It's one of the reasons I remain a Catholic. As far as Vance's elite circle goes, though, the educated had a certain view of religion, and he was largely able to circumvent that with Catholicism. And this is interesting, of course, in the context of Catholic American history, where historically Catholics were the outsiders, but this slowly changed over the course of American history. And some of this anti-Catholic sentiment in early America, too, was explicitly anti-intellectual. Early American anti-intellectualism took aim at formally educated clergy. And so you can see how Vance's attempt to break into the educated elite led him to embrace Catholicism. Something else that draws people in is hierarchy. The Catholic Church has a rigid hierarchy. We love a good authority figure. And some people just prefer a more rigid hierarchy, I think, because it means the expectations are clearer, and this brings a sense of stability, if that makes sense. But there's a certain type of person who is a little weird about it. And I see this more in American adult converts who hold very far-right political beliefs. Another public example of a far-right convert is Candace Owens. Owens converted to Catholicism in large part because of her husband, George Farmer, who is himself a convert. Again, I can't claim to know anyone's full motives, I can't speak on anyone's faith, but I can say that there's a particular context in which this occurred. There's a cherry-picked version of the church online that folds really well into a certain political identity. I also have to say, I was watching some of her videos to research this video, and I noticed that on her set in the background, she has what appears to be a monstrance or a reliquary of some sort. I'm not sure exactly what it is, and I couldn't find an explanation as to what it is, but it looks like a monstrance or a reliquary. And this stood out to me because there's such a contrast between this imagery and the tone of her content. And that's a contrast I notice quite a bit when you have not just political figures, but political commentators and influencers specifically converting to Catholicism. And that leads me to the Trad Cath movement. Trad Caths, or traditional Catholics, are Catholics who place an emphasis on Catholic traditions prior to the Second Vatican Council, which occurred in the 1960s. Trad Caths place an emphasis on the Latin Mass and pre-Vatican II theology, as opposed to sedevacantists who believe every pope since the Second Vatican Council has been an occupier or a pretender. Now, both of these movements predate the internet, as do extremist sects like the one Justice Barrett belongs to, but they gained a lot of recognition and traction online, with Trad Cath quickly becoming a very online aesthetic that bleeds into the larger trad wife, trad life trend we've seen on social media. And this is drawing in converts who are seeking to reject modern life and live more traditionally, as well as cradle Catholics who are returning to their faith. The thing is, though, since a lot of it is now very online, Some of these people are people who enjoy the appearance of Catholicism, but are less focused on living these values in a non aesthetic way, and sometimes only engage with the theology insofar as they think it entitles them to power over others. That is to say, the online Trad Cath aesthetic can attract men who are looking to moralize authority over women, which creates a climate in which female influencers are selling an idea that does very well online, but doesn't necessarily represent reality. To be blunt, the only women who are going to tolerate this attitude are women who stand to earn money from it. Online Trad Cath can be Madonna whore dialed up to an 11, and a lot of the women you'll see participating in it online, not in real life, but online, are selling this as a sexual fantasy. It's kind of the 2020s version of a sexy nun costume. And this exists for a lot of reasons. Like I said, in real life, most converts are just kind souls looking for belonging. People who identify with Catholic culture and beliefs and theology. I'm not taking aim at those people. But as far as the very online go, some people, they see a religious aesthetic, they think it's cool, and they embrace it. Other people, maybe they want to do online virtue signaling, and so they get really wrapped up in online variants of religion, but with little connection to the real theology and culture. As far as the online Trad Cath movement goes, people who are proponents of sedevacantism and critics of Vatican II are really taking advantage of this trend and projecting their beliefs onto the crowd. Extremists often do this on the internet, papering over trends with their fringe ideology to make their ideology seem more popular than it is in real life. And in the process, they sort of meme their fringe ideology into popularity. But I think there are other reasons the Trad Cath movement is so popular online. One is simply, we live in an age of hyper-perception. And what that means is that people now more than ever feel the need to display their identities and to package them for consumption. As a result of this, I think subcultures have largely fallen out of fashion in favor of mere aesthetics. And there are a lot of examples of this completely independent of religion and politics. One example I think is just bag charms. I say this as someone who has bag charms and thinks they're super cute. Trends like this are built around identity curation. Someone looks at you and they know things about you based on what you've displayed. And one of the reasons these trends are becoming more common is because we're being looked at now more than ever due to the internet. Another example is country singers' accents getting stronger. If you listen to Johnny Cash and then Luke Bryan, you'll notice some differences in how they pronounce things. And this isn't just because one is from Georgia and the other is from Texas. Modern country singers prove their authenticity not by performing at prisons and railing against the military-industrial complex, but by displaying a blue-collar aesthetic that is largely detached from the original culture of country music. By the way, if you want a video on how corporate interests hollowed out country music, leave a comment down below. So this isn't just caused by social media alone, but social media does play a role in purity testing. Thousands of people can get together now and decide that your accent isn't strong enough, and so your country identity isn't real, you're not authentic enough, and so you really have to prove yourself to the anonymous crowd by dialing up your accent. And what is a veil on social media if not a Catholic accent? I'm not opposed to veiling, but if you're posting it online, you force me to ask, what is your real motivation for doing this? And the real motivation for doing this isn't just religious, and it's not just aesthetic either. This isn't always just garden variety aesthetic brain or virtue signaling. This can get serious really quickly, especially when the very online don't back down when confronted with the fact that they are very online, and an example of this is Harrison Butker. In 2024, NFL player Harrison Butker gave a commencement address at Benedictine College, a Catholic college in Kansas, in which he lectured female graduates on traditional gender roles.
I want to speak directly to you briefly because I think it is you, the women, who have had the most diabolical lies told to you. How many of you are sitting here now, about to cross this stage, and are thinking about all the promotions and titles you are going to get in your career? Some of you may go on to lead successful careers in the world, but I would venture to guess that the majority of you are most excited about your marriage and the children you will bring into this world. I can tell you that my beautiful wife, Isabel, would be the first to say that her life truly started when she began living her vocation as a wife and as a mother.
The address was denounced by the Benedictine College nuns because, of course it was. The Catholic Church has always upheld that homemaking is not the highest calling for a woman. Religious life is, and it would never occur to most Catholics to denigrate women in this way. One thing the nuns wrote in their statement was, quote, "Instead of promoting unity in our church, our nation, and the world, his comments seem to have fostered division." When I heard this address, I immediately assumed Bucker was a culture war convert who was flirting with sedevacantism, and it turns out he's not actually a convert, but he does promote ideas that do very well on the internet because they're extreme and edgy, but they're not actually aligned with Catholic doctrine and culture. This misalignment exists because there is something more important to him than his Catholic faith: his culture war allegiance. And the culture war allegiance leads me to the second level of this, which is the need to prove yourself not just as a Catholic, but as something else. Because the thing about Trad Cath content is that it doesn't exist in a vacuum. If you find it, you are probably going to find it on a very far right algorithm. And the far right is getting a lot more extreme online for a lot of reasons. One of which is that they're locked in a purity downward spiral that puts them at each other's throats and forces them to be outrageous to prove their purity. You can see this across the board. Now would probably be a good time to mention that this is happening with other religions as well. You have the Orthodoxy bros, some of whom are super nice, genuine people, others who are grifters with lots of abuse allegations. You have extremist evangelicals and fundamentalists whose pre-internet extremism has gained them increased prominence online, but plenty of people of these faiths disavow this behavior. But disavowing it doesn't alleviate the pressure in these spaces to be an extremist. The pressure from the religion and politics crowd is much stronger than, say, the country music crowd. And so you get some very over-the-top displays of religiosity and political allegiance. And due to the historic and modern religious political divide in our country, the two are strongly intertwined, but also at times in conflict with one another, which creates incoherence and can cause purity spiraling, with people, in my view, becoming more extreme in an attempt to outrun this incoherence. The reason I didn't just start this video by saying a lot of Trad Cath influencers are chronically online grifters who are using Catholicism to create the appearance of traditional living and virtue signal is that this is a little more complicated than that. When you consider the history I discussed towards the start, and this is the reason I discussed it, is you can see that they don't just have to prove that they're Catholic, they have to prove that they're American nationalists. But the people some of them are attempting to prove this to have revived nativism, which at its origin is anti-Catholic. That is to say, the American right reviving nativism turned it into a pressure cooker. This was the right turning on itself because nativism was always antithetical to the thing that built the modern right. This is one of many reasons I think the right is infighting right now. Also, there's something to be said for people engaging with extremism online, with niche religious and political sects, because it feels very fun and edgy, and then they meme themselves into aligning with these communities only to realize too late that it was never just a meme. Irony poisoning is our generation's lead paint. In my view, this is how you wind up with so many online Trad Caths flirting with sedevacantism. It lets them be Catholic without being Catholic, and it lets them be far-right nationalists and culture war shitposters while gleaning a sense of moral and intellectual superiority from Catholic culture. They can tap into the aesthetics and history of Catholicism and, again, glean what moral and intellectual superiority they can from that without having to submit to the Pope's authority. You know, I can remember fandom culture fusing with left-wing politics in the 2010s to create the "your fave is problematic" witch hunts, and I think the right is finally catching up to the culture here. But it's worse because it's not teenagers with a One Direction obsession calling you homophobic for not believing the Larry Stylinson conspiracy theory. It's grown men and women who are pastors and commentators and politicians. Also, this is a really weird connection, but I grew up with a girl who was a Larry Stylinson conspiracy theorist. She had merch and a Tumblr blog, the whole 9 yards, and she is now a Trad Cath, so I don't know. There's a certain type of personality that is drawn into these things online, and they kind of have our political system in a chokehold at the moment. So, again, trad cath culture is being fueled by a lot of things. Some people have an interest in traditional aesthetics, others a desire for intellectualism and hierarchy. Quite a few are just grifting and virtue signaling, but there's something else here, which is political extremism. And it's all kind of together in the same soup, so it can be hard to separate. But what I'll say is that the mark of a culture war grifter is that they choose their politics over their religion. If what they're saying does not align with their religion, odds are they are not mistaken. They are just using their religion as an aesthetic in a bid to lend their culture war talking points some moral and intellectual authority. It's a gross abuse of religion, and I know I'm not the only religious person made uncomfortable by this. What's worse is what I mentioned when talking about Harrison Bucker, which is that when called out, even by actual orders within their religion, they don't back down. Bucker doubled down and didn't even acknowledge that the nuns denounced him, which is, in my view, more egregious even than his original comments. And I want to close this video by pointing out one final thing. The American culture war was originally started by the pro-life movement to bring Christian denominations together. But with the internet enabling extreme religious factions, it could potentially push those denominations apart. And we can see this in culture war political appointees, such as Pete Hegseth. One of the reasons we are here is literally just edgy meme culture. For some reason, some people thought upsetting leftists on the internet makes someone qualified for geopolitics. One more thing is that the 3 presidential frontrunners for 2028 are J.D. Vance, Ron DeSantis, and Gavin Newsom, all of whom are Catholic. That is to say, the next election is going to be a very interesting one.